In 2017, a team of geneticists published the first comprehensive ancient DNA study of the Aegean Bronze Age, analyzing skeletal remains from individuals who had lived over 3,000 years ago in the civilizations that would later become the foundation of Western culture. The results ended a debate that had consumed archaeologists for over a century, and the answer was not what anyone expected. The two civilizations in question are the Minoans of Crete and the Mycenaeans of mainland Greece. They were not the same people. They were not from the same place. And their relationship to the Greeks who came after them was not the simple continuous lineage that classical education had always implied. The Minoans built the first true urban civilization in Europe, a palace-centered society on the island of Crete that, at its height, around 1700 BC, possessed running water, multi-story buildings, advanced drainage systems, and an artistic tradition of extraordinary sophistication. Their palace at Knossos covered more than 20,000 square meters and housed thousands of people. They traded with Egypt, with the Levant, with Anatolia. Their ships carried tin, copper, saffron, and olive oil across the eastern Mediterranean. They were the dominant sea power of their world. The Mycenaeans were the warrior culture that dominated mainland Greece from roughly 1600 to 1100 BC. They built the great citadels whose massive stone walls still stand at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Athens. Their rulers are buried in shaft graves, surrounded by golden death masks, silver vessels, and the weapons of heroes. They were the people of the Iliad, of Agamemnon, of Achilles, of the siege of Troy. Whether or not Troy itself is historical, the culture that Homer describes is real and archaeologically confirmed. The question that divided scholars was simple. Where did these people come from? The DNA finally answered it. The study was published in the journal Nature in August 2017. The lead researcher was Johannes Krauss of the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, working with colleagues from Harvard, the University of Athens, and multiple other institutions. For most of the 20th century, the origin of the Minoans was one of the great unsolved mysteries of European archaeology. The man who excavated Knossos, the British archaeologist Arthur Evans, believed the Minoans had African origins, a theory based on the physical appearance of figures in Minoan art and on what Evans interpreted as stylistic connections with North African cultures. Other scholars proposed origins in the Levant, in Anatolia, or in Egypt. The 2017 DNA study, published in Nature, resolved this debate directly. Minoan remains from Bronze Age Crete showed genetic profiles that were most closely related to ancient Anatolian Neolithic farmers, the same early agricultural communities from modern-day Turkey whose descendants had been spreading across Europe for thousands of years. There was no significant sub-Saharan African ancestry. There was no Near Eastern Bronze Age admixture of the type that would indicate a migration from the Levant during the Minoan period. The Minoans were genetically most similar to the early farming communities that had populated the Aegean islands in the Neolithic, thousands of years before the great palaces were built. This finding aligned with the archaeological evidence for cultural continuity in Crete from the Neolithic through the Bronze Age. The same island, the same basic population, developing incrementally toward the sophistication of Minoan civilization, rather than arriving as a culturally advanced intrusion from somewhere else. The Minoans left an alphabet, called Linear A, that has never been deciphered. Over 1,500 inscriptions in Linear A are known, carved on clay tablets and painted on vessels found at Knossos and other sites. Despite decades of scholarly effort and the application of computational methods, Linear A remains unreadable. The language it encodes appears to be unrelated to any known language family. When the Mycenaeans conquered Crete and adopted the Minoan writing system, they modified it to write Greek, creating Linear B, which was finally deciphered in 1952 by Michael Ventris. but the original Minoan language remains, 3,500 years after the civilization fell, a complete mystery. The palace economy of Knossos was, in organizational terms, strikingly modern. The Mycenaeans were different from the Minoans in a way that the 2017 DNA study quantified precisely. Their genetic profile was not simply Anatolian Neolithic farmer ancestry. It was a mixture, and the second component was the crucial one. The Mycenaeans carried ancestry from the Eurasian steppe, the same Yamnaya-related pastoralist genetic signal that had transformed the genetics of most of Europe during the Bronze Age, bringing with it the Indo-European languages that became Greek, Latin, Celtic, Germanic, and Sanskrit. This steppe ancestry was present in the Mycenaean DNA at levels ranging from 4 to 16%, modest in absolute terms, but absent from the Minoan samples entirely, and decisive in its implications. The presence of steppe ancestry in the Mycenaeans, but not the Minoans, confirms what historical linguists had long argued on different grounds, that the Greek language, which is Indo-European, arrived in Greece with a migration from the east or northeast, from the direction of the Eurasian steppe, at some point before the Mycenaean civilization consolidated. The Minoans, who spoke a non-Indo-European language, were not part of this migration. They were the pre-existing Aegean population into which the incoming steppe ancestry migrants mixed, producing the Mycenaean genetic and cultural profile. Linear B, the Mycenaean writing system, adapted from Minoan Linear A, is the oldest form of the Greek language that has survived. The tablets found at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Knossos after the Mycenaeans took Crete are administrative records, inventories of goods, tallies of livestock, records of rations distributed to workers. They are not epic poetry or religious texts. They are bureaucratic paperwork. But the language in which they are written, Proto-Greek from around 1450 BC, is recognizably the ancestor of the Greek that Homer's epics would be composed in several centuries later. The DNA confirmed the genetic ancestry. The tablets confirmed the linguistic ancestry. Together, they tell the same story. The difference in steppe ancestry between the Minoans and Mycenaeans, 0% versus 4 to 16%, may seem small in absolute terms. But population geneticists note that it represents a real and statistically robust signal, not a measurement artifact. The most iconic image from Minoan civilization is the bull-leaping fresco from Knossos, a brilliantly colored painting showing a figure somersaulting over the back of a charging bull, while two other figures on either side appear to assist. It is one of the most reproduced images from the ancient Mediterranean world, and it is also one of the most debated. Was bull leaping an actual athletic performance? Was it a religious ritual, a form of worship or propitiation of the divine bull that features prominently in Minoan symbolism? Was it a rite of passage? The fresco is not unique. Bull-leaping images appear across Minoan art in multiple media and at multiple sites, so it clearly represented something central to Minoan culture. Physical analysis of the athletes' bodies in the paintings suggests the activity was real. The poses depicted are biomechanically feasible, and some researchers have argued that the sequence of movements is consistent with an actual vaulting technique. The physical evidence for Minoan religion took a darker turn with the 1979 discovery at a site called Animaspilia on Crete. Archaeologists excavating a small temple destroyed in an earthquake around 1700 BC found a scene that had been preserved in almost photographic detail by the sudden collapse of the structure. 3 human skeletons were found in one room, one on an altar, its bones showing evidence of having been tightly bound before death. One nearby in a posture consistent with the person having been performing a ritual action at the moment of the earthquake, and one that may have been carrying a ritual vessel when the building collapsed. The altar-bound individual has been interpreted by its excavators as evidence of human sacrifice. a practice that Greek mythology attributed to the Minoans in stories like that of the Minotaur, but that mainstream archaeology had always assumed was mythological exaggeration. The Mask of Agamemnon, the famous golden death mask found by Heinrich Schliemann in the shaft graves of Mycenae in 1876, was named by Schliemann in a telegram to the Greek king, declaring that he had gazed upon the face of Agamemnon. Modern dating has established that the mask predates any historical Agamemnon by several centuries. But as an artifact of Mycenaean royal burial practice, the use of hammered gold to cover the face of the dead, it remains one of the most powerful objects in the archaeology of the ancient world. In 2015, archaeologists Jack Davis and Sharon Stocker of the University of Cincinnati, excavating near the ancient palace of Pylos in southwestern Greece, discovered a Mycenaean shaft grave that had not been looted since it was sealed approximately 3,500 years ago. The burial contained a single individual, a man, roughly 30 to 35 years of age at death, surrounded by over 1,400 artifacts, including bronze weapons, jewelry of gold, silver and ivory, and 4 extraordinary carved gemstones, whose miniature scenes, rendered with magnifying glass precision, depict combat, ritual, and mythological subjects at a level of craftsmanship that left the excavating team speechless. The individual was named the Griffin Warrior, after an ivory plaque carved with a griffin, a mythological creature combining eagle and lion, found with the burial. DNA analysis of the Griffin Warrior, published in a follow-up study, confirmed that he was a genetically typical Mycenaean male of his period, carrying the combination of Anatolian Neolithic and steppe ancestry that characterizes the Mycenaean genetic profile. He was not a foreigner. He was not of exotic origin. He was a local elite warrior, buried with the finest objects that the Bronze Age Aegean world could produce, including artifacts with Minoan stylistic origins that documented the cultural exchange between the two civilizations. The question of King Minos and the Minotaur deserves the same kind of treatment. The story, as Greek mythology presents it, a king of Crete, a monster imprisoned in a labyrinth, annual tribute of young Athenians sacrificed to the beast, is clearly mythological. But the labyrinthine multi-story palace at Knossos, with its confusing corridors and bull symbolism, and the archaeological evidence for Minoan dominance over mainland Aegean communities, provides a realistic basis for the mythological elaboration. Myths are rarely invented from nothing. They are usually transformations of real historical memories into symbolic narratives. The Griffin Warrior's grave goods also included an elaborate bronze mirror and a set of personal grooming objects, items that, in the context of the warrior's other possessions, suggest a culture in which physical appearance and personal presentation were as valued as military prowess. The question of women's roles in Minoan and Mycenaean society is one where the artistic record and the DNA evidence, together, provide a picture that challenges the assumptions carried over from classical Greek civilization, where women's lives were severely constrained. Minoan art is dominated by images of women. This is unusual in the ancient world. Most ancient cultures with strong artistic traditions depict men as the primary social actors. In Minoan art, women are shown in positions of authority and ritual centrality, presiding over ceremonies, directing processions, occupying the highest positions in formal compositions. The famous snake goddess figurines, women in elaborate flounced skirts, bare-breasted, holding serpents in each hand, are interpreted as either priestesses or deities. Whether they represent real human religious specialists or supernatural figures, their consistent depiction suggests that the female body was associated with divine power in Minoan religious thought. The costume question is legitimate. Minoan women's dress, as depicted in the frescoes and figurines, frequently involves an open bodice exposing the breasts. This has been interpreted variously as evidence of a sexually liberated society, as a specifically ritual garment worn in religious contexts, or as an artistic convention rather than everyday dress. The physical evidence of actual garments, preserved in occasional textile fragments and in the traces left in waterlogged archaeological deposits, does not definitively resolve which interpretation is correct. Ancient DNA analysis of Minoan and Mycenaean burial populations has contributed to the gender question. Several female burials from Mycenaean contexts, particularly from shaft graves and pholos tombs, contain weapons and armor alongside their occupants. In some cases, the association of women with weapons might reflect the weapon's value as prestige objects rather than their function as combat tools. In others, the skeletal evidence of physical stress patterns consistent with weapon use and horseback riding suggests that the association was functional. The genealogical analysis possible through ancient DNA has also revealed the extent to which the royal and elite families of Mycenae practiced strategic marriage, bringing individuals from other regions into the burial population, creating genetic diversity within the social elite that is not present in the general population. Around 1620 BC, the precise date is still debated by archaeologists and geologists, the volcanic island of Thera, located in the southern Aegean Sea, approximately 100 kilometers north of Crete, experienced one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the past 10,000 years of human history. The eruption ejected an estimated 60 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. The resulting ash cloud spread across thousands of kilometers, leaving detectable tephra deposits in ice cores from Greenland, in lake sediments from Turkey and Bulgaria, in tree rings from California and Ireland. The eruption rating places it among the most powerful in recorded geological history, comparable to or exceeding the 1815 Tambora eruption that caused the year without a summer. The ancient town of Akrotiri on Thera, a prosperous Minoan settlement preserved under the volcanic ash like a Bronze Age Pompeii, provides evidence that the inhabitants had warning and evacuated before the final catastrophe. Unlike Pompeii, few human remains have been found at Akrotiri. The town's art, however, survived. Frescoes of extraordinary quality depicting landscapes, seascapes, young men fishing, a naval procession, and the famous blue monkeys that indicate cultural contact with Africa or South Asia. The tsunami generated by the Thera eruption and caldera collapse would have reached the northern coast of Crete within minutes. The destruction of coastal Minoan settlements and the Minoan naval infrastructure is documented archaeologically. Whether the eruption alone was sufficient to end Minoan civilization, or whether it merely weakened it sufficiently for Mycenaean conquest to follow, remains debated. What is not debated is that the Minoan presence in the archaeological record diminishes sharply in the period after the eruption. Plato's account of Atlantis, written around 360 BC and the source of all subsequent Atlantis mythology, describes an advanced island civilization that sank into the sea as divine punishment. The location, the date, and the manner of destruction are close enough to the Thera eruption and the Minoan civilization that most serious scholars consider the Atlantis story a distorted memory of the Bronze Age Aegean catastrophe. The Bronze Age collapse of around 1200 BC was one of the most comprehensive civilizational catastrophes in recorded history. Comparable in scope to the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but faster and more complete. In the space of approximately 50 years, virtually every major urban civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean either collapsed entirely or was so severely disrupted that it never recovered its previous level of complexity. The Mycenaean palace centers of Pylos, Tiryns, and Mycenae were burned and abandoned. The Hittite Empire, which had rivaled Egypt as the dominant power of the Near East, collapsed completely, with its capital Hattusa sacked and burned. The cities of the Levantine coast, including the great trading city of Ugarit, were destroyed and not rebuilt. Egypt survived, but was profoundly weakened. The palace economies that had sustained the interconnected Bronze Age trading world simply stopped functioning. Into this disruption came the Sea Peoples, the mysterious confederacy of maritime raiders and migrants documented in Egyptian temple inscriptions from the reign of Ramses III around 1177 BC. The DNA evidence for the Sea Peoples, discussed in an earlier episode of this series, connects them primarily to Aegean populations, to the descendants of the Mycenaean and related cultural sphere, displaced by the same collapse that destroyed their home civilization. The destroyers and the destroyed may have been biologically related. The Bronze Age collapse also ended the sophisticated international trade networks that had made the complexity of both Minoan and Mycenaean civilization possible. Without the flow of tin from Central Asia and copper from Cyprus that produced the bronze for tools and weapons, without the grain surpluses that fed the specialist craftspeople and administrators of the palace economies, the entire interlocking system of exchange broke down. The palace centers were not just political centers, they were economic engines, and when they stopped, everything that depended on them stopped too. The Mycenaean collapse brought a specific cultural catastrophe, the loss of writing. Linear B, the bureaucratic script of the Mycenaean palace system, disappeared along with the palace administrators who had used it. For approximately 4 centuries, Greece had no writing. The so-called Greek Dark Ages were not merely a period of economic and political decline. They were a period of genuine cultural amnesia, in which the technical achievements of the Mycenaean world were lost and had to be slowly reconstructed. The physical achievements of Minoan and Mycenaean civilization are only now being fully appreciated through the combination of archaeological analysis and the new analytical tools that ancient DNA-era science has brought to the study of ancient materials. The Palace of Knossos had, by conservative archaeological estimate, a main drainage system with terracotta pipes that used gravity flow to remove waste and rainwater. The bathrooms and latrines of the palace had flush-like mechanisms using water poured from jugs. The building techniques demonstrated in the multi-story construction at Knossos, including the use of timber frame construction within stone masonry to provide earthquake flexibility, represent engineering knowledge that would not be fully redeveloped in Europe until the modern era. The ancient Cretans were building earthquake-resistant structures roughly 3,500 years ago. The Cyclopean walls of Mycenae and Tiryns, so called because later Greek generations believed that only the mythological one-eyed giants called Cyclopes could have moved the enormous limestone blocks used in their construction, are among the most impressive defensive structures in the ancient world. The Lion Gate at Mycenae, with its massive lintel stone and flanking sculptures, represents the earliest surviving monumental sculpture in Europe. The metal trade networks that sustained Bronze Age civilization were extraordinarily complex. Bronze requires tin and copper mixed in specific proportions. Neither metal was locally available in most Aegean locations. Isotope analysis of bronze objects from Mycenaean and Minoan contexts has traced the copper to sources in Cyprus and southern Spain, and the tin to sources as distant as Afghanistan and Central Europe. A bronze spearhead from a Mycenaean warrior's grave carries in its metal the isotopic signatures of mines that were operating thousands of kilometers from where the warrior fought and died. The astronomical knowledge embedded in the orientation of Bronze Age Aegean structures is still being studied. The main hall of the palace at Knossos shows alignments consistent with solar events. The Cyclopean citadels of mainland Greece show consistent orientation patterns that appear to reflect cosmological thinking. Whether these alignments were intentional design features or coincidental results of practical construction considerations remains a subject of active research. Let's bring the complete picture together, because the DNA story of the Minoans and Mycenaeans is not just ancient history. It connects directly to the modern world through a genetic thread that has been specifically quantified. The 2017 Nature study that provided the genetic profiles of Minoans and Mycenaeans also compared those ancient profiles against modern Greek populations. The results were clear. Modern Greeks show genetic continuity with the Mycenaean period population at a substantial level. Over 70% of their ancestry traces to the Bronze Age Aegean population, with the remainder contributed by subsequent migrations, including Roman period admixture, medieval Slavic movements into the northern Greek peninsula, and Ottoman period demographic changes. Modern Greeks are, in a measurable and specific genetic sense, the descendants of the people who built Mycenae and fought at Troy. The biological continuity from the Bronze Age to the present in the Greek population is among the strongest such documented continuities in European ancient DNA research. The Minoan component is also present, because the Mycenaeans, who absorbed the Minoan population after the Bronze Age collapse, carried Minoan ancestry forward into the Greek population. When modern Greeks carry Minoan genetic heritage, they carry it mediated through the Mycenaeans, who absorbed the Cretans, rather than eliminating them. The two civilizations that produced the foundational myths of Western culture, the labyrinth and the Minotaur, the Trojan War, the heroic warrior ideal, the origins of the Olympic Games, the architectural vocabulary of columns and capitals, were genetically real. Their bones have been analyzed, their DNA has been sequenced, and the result is that the people we imagined as legendary turn out to have been the actual biological ancestors of real people living in Greece today. The DNA does not diminish the myths, it grounds them. It places the heroes in bodies, in families, in genetic lineages that we can now trace forward from the Bronze Age to the present. Ancient DNA makes history personal. It makes legends biological. And in the case of the Minoans and Mycenaeans, it makes one of humanity's oldest and most resonant stories. The story of how civilization began at the western edge of the ancient world. Not a legend, but a fact. The science is not finished. New ancient DNA studies of Bronze Age Aegean populations are published regularly, expanding the geographic and temporal coverage of the 2017 study. The Bronze Age civilizations of the Aegean are the genetic and cultural bedrock on which all of Western history was built.